I finished with the adding of Jesus' family coming to visit him, as I already had in Matthew and Mark. Now comes the difficult part, because the next set of events in the story are really confusing as to what the order is and what the timeline is, and here's why. The very next verse in Luke, after Jesus said, "My mother, my brethren are these which hear the word of God and do it," verse 22, Luke 8, "Now it came to pass on a certain day that he went into a ship with his disciples and said to them, Let us go over to the other side, and they launched forth. He fell asleep, there was a storm, he calmed the storm." So the timeline is that sometime this happened. It's not clear when. And most likely, that would make you believe that this is not that exact same day that Jesus finished these words. You think it's in the future. It could be the next day or sometime in the future. Unless it really was this day, and for some reason, Luke decides to take a big step back from the story and just say, and someday, on a certain day, he went into a boat. Even though that is literally that same exact day that he just finished in the verse before. So Luke seems to be saying, in the future, he gets into a boat, there's a storm, he calms the storm. In Matthew, however, it continues on to say the same day, right? "Whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same is my brother and sister and mother." That's the end of chapter 12. The very first verse in chapter 13 says, "The same day went Jesus out of the house by the seaside, the great multitudes gathered. He got into a ship, sat, and spoke, beginning with the parable of the sower. His disciples come to him, ask him, explain this parable. He explains it, then he goes on and explains the parable of the wheat and the tares. Again, after that, he goes into the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. And then, after all these things, he sent the multitudes away, went into a house, probably this exact same house that the previous event was at, where he healed the possessed man, accused of blasphemy. He responds, his family is going to meet him because they were all inside, right? And it says your family are outside. They're at the house. So now he goes back into the house, still continuing on in Matthew 13. His disciples say, "Declare to us the parable of the tares." So then he explains that. Goes on for a while, gives them some other words of wisdom. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant man. And after that, the story skips around. So the important part of this next event in Matthew is that it says that same day, from when his family came to visit him and he said, "This is my family," he then goes into a ship and preaches the parable of the sower that same day. Whereas Luke said, someday, seeming to refer to the future, not the same day, he goes into a boat and crosses, and the storm comes and he calms the sea. Now the issue arises when you look at the story in Mark. Mark continues after his family comes, end of chapter 3, verse 35, "For whosoever shall do the will of God, the same is my brother, my sister, my mother." Beginning of chapter 4, "And he began again to teach by the seaside," and which we know is the same day because of Matthew. "Great multitudes, he got into a ship to preach to the multitudes by the sea on the land. He taught them the parable of the sower. They ask him, explain us this parable. He explains it, just like in Matthew. And then he goes on, he explains some other stuff. He says, "Is a candle brought under a bushel or under a bed? No, a candle set on a candlestick. Whatever is hidden will be made manifest." He goes on to say, "The kingdom of God is like a man shall cast seed into the ground." And then he goes on, still this, continuing on, the same passage, same chapter, "Grain of a mustard seed." Then, a few verses later, "And the same day, when the evening was come, he said to them, Let us pass over the other side. And there arose a great storm of wind. The waves beat, so there's a great storm. He calms the storm." So Mark is very clear that the same day he's preaching this parable of the sower, and then he goes on to explain and gives more parables like the parable of the mustard seed. He says that same day he gets into a ship. It's evening now. They go to the other side. There's the storm, and he calms the storm. But that's a bit of an issue. Matthew says clearly the same day his family comes, he gets into a ship, preaches the parable of the sower, parable of the wheat and tares. Mark picks up with the parable of the sower and says that same day he gets into a ship and there's the storm and he calms the storm. Luke says someday, on a certain day. So that's kind of easy to overrule. Just say it's not just a certain day. I can pick from Luke chapter 8 verses 22. I could just say it wasn't just on a certain day throughout all the days of all of history. I could just say it's that day, because that day is a certain day, and I can just overrule what it seems to be saying that a day in the future. But it gets way more complicated than that because of the timing of when Jesus' disciples ask him to explain the parables that he's telling to the multitudes. So far, I'm looking as if all these events are on the same day. His parents come. Matthew clearly says the same day he gets into a boat, tells the parable of the sower. Mark says the same day as the parable of the sower is the day he gets into a boat again and leaves, and there's the storm and he calms the storm. That's what I'm looking at right now. It's all one day. But in Matthew, it says that after he speaks the parable of the sower, you know he's in a boat. It says in Matthew 13, verse 10, and the disciples came and said to him, why speak you to them in parables? Now Jesus is on a boat. It doesn't say all his disciples are there in the boat with him. It just says in verse 2, great multitudes were gathered together to him so that he went into a ship. He went into a ship and sat, and the multitude stood by the shore, and he spoke to them in parables. It makes sense. It seems as though he's the only one in the boat. But maybe all his other disciples are with him. Or some who could ask him this question and he could give it to them, the answer. Possibly even Matthew, because Matthew is one of the followers. He is writing this account. Perhaps he was actually there. We don't know. After he gives the explanation, though, it goes on in the same chapter, verse 24, to say, another parable he put forth to them, saying. So it seems as though he's now speaking to the multitudes again. But you could possibly think that maybe he's giving this parable of the wheat and the tares only to his disciples. I don't think so. I think that somehow he gave this explanation to the disciples, but in a different setting now. He's speaking to the entire multitude again to give the parable of the wheat and the tares. He gives this parable. Verse 31, another parable he put forth to them. Who's them? Is it the disciples? Is it the whole multitude? We're not sure. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. Another parable he spoke to them. We're still not sure who them is. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. Verse 34, all these things spoke Jesus to the multitudes in parables. So now it makes it pretty clear. This them, the parable of the wheat and the tares, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, is like leaven. It seems as though all of those are to the multitudes. And it says, spoke to the multitudes in parables. Verse 36, then Jesus sent the multitudes away and went into the house. His disciples came to him saying, declare to us the parable of the wheat and the tares. So now, this is later on in the chapter, his disciples are asking him for another explanation of a different parable. First it was the parable of the sower, now it's the parable of the wheat and the tares. What happened? Did Jesus sit in the boat in the sea, giving the parable of the sower to the people? Did he row back to land, spend some time with his disciples? They ask him for the explanation of the parable of the sower? Or did his disciples come out to him in the boat? Or were they already there in the boat with him to get that explanation? Because it's pretty clear the next thing he says, the parable of the wheat and tares, is again to the multitudes. Then Jesus comes in, goes to the house, and his disciples ask him for another explanation. Or is it? It could be a bit differently, and I have a theory on that, so just keep that in mind. One idea is that Jesus came in, gave the explanation, goes back out, gives another parable, comes back in, and then dismisses everyone and gives another explanation. A second option is that his disciples are already with him, or that they came out to him, got the explanation. Then Jesus gives another parable, wheat and tares. He comes in, dismisses everyone. They get their second explanation. Let's take a look at Mark. Mark says, he taught them many things by parables, said to them his doctrine. This is where it gets really tricky. Immediately after the parable of the sower, in Mark 4, verse 10, when he was alone, they that were about him with the 12 asked of him the parable. When he said to them, to you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, he explains the parable of the sower. He's alone now. This is after the explanation of the first parable he gave. When he was alone, they that were about him with the 12. So is this a larger group of people? The 12 and some other set of followers? It's not the multitude anymore, because it says he's alone. So it's some smaller group. Maybe it's, you can't say he was alone and everyone then came to him. He's not alone anymore. Obviously, he's not going to be alone when the 12 are there, but it really seems to convey that a smaller group of people came to him. The 12 and maybe a few more. So then this is confusing. Did he dismiss all the crowds of people? Then he's alone, gives this first explanation of the parable of the sower, and then goes back out into the sea, and the whole multitude comes back the same day and gives the next parable? That seems highly unlikely. Highly unlikely that everyone's going to leave and come back the same day, so that what is clear from Matthew and Mark, the same day his family was there, he gets into the boat, is the same day he gives the parable, and he leaves that night and calms the storm. Can you see how it's starting to get really confusing? He's alone at this point. Later on, it doesn't say he gives the parable of the wheat and the tares in Mark, but because it's in Matthew, I'm going to include it. And it seems as though it's the same day, so that would all go together. It seems as though. But again, I think I have an explanation. Hold that thought. He goes on, candle under a bushel, what's hidden will be manifest. Again, at the end of all these explanations, kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. Verse 33, Mark 4, and with many such parables spoke he the word to them as they were able to hear it. But without a parable spoke he not to them, and when they were alone, he expounded all things to his disciples. These explanations that he's giving to his disciples are when they're alone. The multitude is not there anymore. And then the next verse, and the same day when the evening was come, he said to them, let us pass over the other side. And there arose a great storm. Storm he calls storm. Okay, so Mark is very clear. He gives his explanation to the disciples when they are by themselves. Much fewer people. The multitudes are dismissed, and they get into a ship, and there's the storm. He calms the storm. And make sure everything is being included. Let's look at Luke and see what's going on. Luke 8, in verse 4, it says, when many people were gathered together and were come to him out of every city. So this could be the setting of them on the land. He's in the boat. It doesn't clearly say that, but from Matthew and Mark, it's clear. That's the scenario. He immediately gives the parable of the sower. Going on, his disciples asked him, what might this parable be? He gives the explanation, just like in the others. So that's all fine. And then it goes on to his family coming to see him, but we know that came from earlier. And then they get into a ship. Let us go to the other side. He falls asleep. The storm comes. He calms the storm. So that's what goes on. It doesn't say when. It just says, like I started, on a certain day, but we're pretty sure this is the same day. Now, in his explanation, he goes on to say, no man who has lighted a candle covers in a vessel. Everything that is secret will be made manifest. He who has, more will be given. It's pretty much the same as in Mark. So it follows. The parable of the sower, explanation, parable of wheat and tares. Disciples are sent away, they're alone, and they ask for that second explanation. Before I give you my theory, I want to tell you what Michael Rood's theory is. This makes it even more confusing, if I will, because he says that the events of the parable of the sower and the explanation, at least, of the parable of the wheat and the tares are on different days. It doesn't clearly say which day, it just says week 26 of Jesus' ministry, of his parable of the sower. his explanation of the parable of the sower, and his parable of the wheat and the tares. Week 26. Then week 27, so clearly it has to be another day, Jesus goes into the house and gives his explanation of the wheat and the tares. Which doesn't make sense according to what is clearly seen in Matthew and Mark, that the same day his family comes to talk to him is the same day he gives the parable of the sower, which is the same day as the parable of the wheat and the tares, and then his explanation of the parable of the sower in Mark is the same day that he gets into the boat, goes into the sea, storm comes, he calms the storm. So like I said from the beginning, it seems like it's all one day. Like Rude says, it's 2 days. That sort of explains how he could be alone when giving his explanation to the disciples. How he gives the parable of the sower, and then he does come in. This is Michael Rude's theory. It's got to be how he understands it. How he goes out into the boat, gives the parable, comes back in, and you're just going to have to understand that the multitudes leave. During that night, he gives his explanation to the disciples, because in Mark it clearly says they're alone. Even for that first explanation. You could see from Mark that he gives a parable, then they're alone. So the multitudes must have left. Michael Rude says, or at least infers through his explanation, that they're 2 different weeks, therefore at least 2 different days, it's got to be, that he goes out of the boat, gives the parable, comes back in, everyone leaves, he gives his explanation. Then he must be also saying that he gets back into the boat the next day, gives the next parable of the wheat and the tares, and there's obviously a multitude there again, and then comes back in, everyone leaves again, when it actually says they dismissed the crowds because they were going to cross over, and gives them their next explanation. I don't know how else you could say that these are 2 different days and that Jesus was alone during both his explanations, even though he said the parable to the crowd. That it must have been 2 different days. One day speaking to a crowd, explanation in private. Next day speaking to the crowd, explanation in private again. But again, this is all Michael Rude's. I still have a theory. The problem is that if I'm going to get that explanation of the timeline from Michael Rude, it would leave a bunch of things unexplained when you're reading through this work, my project of putting things in timeline. Because I don't want to put these notes that he's putting. I don't want to put that this was the next week, therefore saying it's the next day. But if I put no notes, and if I just put it like that, it would make it seem like he's speaking to the crowds, and then somehow the disciples are near him to get a private interpretation. And then, without an explanation, he's continuing on his parable, and you would just have to guess he's still speaking to the crowds. But I mean, it's kind of how it's written in Matthew. After he gives the parable of the sower, it says in verse 10, and the disciples came and said to him, why speak you to them in parables? He gives his explanation. Then it just continues on in verse 24. Another parable he put forth to them. He gives the parable of the wheat and the tares, and it's explained later that he's speaking to the multitude. So you just have to guess, you just have to figure it out. That he's speaking to the crowds, explanation in private, speaking the next parable to the crowds, and another explanation in private, because that's from Mark. Both explanations are in private. So, I could leave it how it's written in Matthew and Mark. I could put them together without notes, which is what I want to do, and just say that he's speaking to the crowds and he's giving explanations, and then it'll be sort of clear through the different contextual clues that the interpretation is private to the disciples only, not to everyone. Or, and here's my crazy theory,